First of all, nobody asked your ancestors to come here and destroy and displace indigenous communities and unalive our women, our children, and our people for our unceded traditional lands, or violate and abuse our children in your churches, Indian residential schools, the child welfare system, the 60s scoop, as well as the Indian day schools, etc., and steal our children and force them to assimilate in your genocidal prisons, also known as the Indian residential schools. And we can't forget about our missing and murdered indigenous women. And the government and white settlers and their colonial tactics have managed to destroy and create a lot of damage to 7 generations of our people. And it's going to take 7 future generations to fully recover, if that's at all possible. Canada owes Indigenous people Indigenous trust funds in the trillions that were meant for Indigenous communities but were misused to build the cities you live in, so you can have a comfortable, cozy life and somewhere to live. While some Indigenous communities across what we now call Canada live in condemned housing with boarded up windows, no running water, and have minimal heat in well below zero weather conditions. I was one of those people who was raised on the reserve with no running water and under a boil water advisory. And yes, sometimes you can blame band councils for mismanaging the money or for not doing their jobs properly. But we also have to remember that band councils are a forced government system into our communities, which in my opinion, no excuses, but if they are corrupt at times, they are only leading by the example of your government. But let's not get things twisted here. Indigenous people would not be in any of these circumstances had your ancestors just stayed where they came from. And while you complain about paying taxes, which doesn't come to us by the way, but nice try. Aside from the unpaid rent that nobody pays Indigenous communities for living on unceded lands and taking up Indigenous spaces, let's not forget, we never asked your European ancestors to come here. So this colonial system is yours, not ours. So what makes you think you have any right to complain? Indigenous people pay taxes all the time, whether your status or not, depending on where you live. I personally owe $14,000 in college student loans because there simply was not enough funding to cover everyone in my First Nations community. So trust me, your theory that every single Indigenous person gets everything paid for, including education, is really quite false. But you have to keep in mind that we are largely underfunded and that everyone's not always covered. In addition to that, we now have the pretendian problem. And if any Indigenous people ever get a monthly check from social assistance, ODSP, or OAS, it's not any more than what my Caucasian neighbor gets here in Toronto. And believe it or not, we are short-funded and treated unequally in almost every sector you can think of, including education, housing, healthcare, etc. Don't you think that Canada owes Indigenous people something? In the very least, equal healthcare and free education. Especially when you consider that there were laws passed through government legislation that forbid First Nations people from attending college and universities through the Indian Act policy, which would relinquish our Indian status and our rights as First Nations people if we decided to pursue this Eurocentric Western education, which was built on colonial values and white settler perspectives. So this country, what we now call Canada, was built on the premise that there was an Indian problem. And as we go through the process of this so-called truth and reconciliation, the jobs you speak of are in fact Indigenous positions, which should be Indigenous-led and requires someone with Indigenous lived experiences. So that means some people just simply do not qualify. There are a lot of Indigenous people in Canada, and whether you like it or not, we deserve to have equal opportunities and to have a seat at the table. And these are positions that cannot be fulfilled by someone like you, and that's just a fact. Of course, considering that we have everything for free. But I can assure you, we are resilient and we work our asses off to get to where we want to be. But let me guess, taking unceded traditional lands from Indigenous people, committing crimes such as genocide and forced assimilation, committing Indigenous identity fraud, criminalizing Indigenous land defenders and First Nations communities through this white colonial justice system for standing up against infraction, and the ongoing theft of land is not enough. So who's the entitled one here? Not to mention, prioritizing Indigenous people for very few job positions is a result of ongoing exclusion. You have all the opportunities in the world simply for just being a European descendant. So if anyone gets anything for free, it certainly isn't Indigenous people who paid a huge price to white colonial greed, just for simply existing and living as the first people to walk these lands. And let's also not forget that Indigenous people welcomed European settlers and were willing to share these lands. But no, that wasn't enough. You had to misuse the land, force displacement of our communities, polluted our waters, stuck your nose where it didn't belong, and interfered with Indigenous communities, their sovereignty, their way of life, and their inherent rights to self-determination. And now we have Indigenous identity fraud, which is nothing more than fraud, deception, and ongoing colonialism. So in the words of the great former Senator Murray St. Clair, ask yourself, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I?